Some dare call it conspiracy.
Welcome to the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy podcast, hosted by Brent Lee and Neil Sanders. After nearly 20 years exploring the world of conspiracy culture, we are taking our guests and listeners on a guided tour of the rabbit hole. Our mission? To discover where the truth lies. Mr. David Cartland is a former general practitioner from Cornwall who was struck off the UK Medical Register in June 2025. As of February 2026, he is no longer a GMC registered doctor and operates as a non-registered healthcare advisor and health coach. This is taken directly from his website, Dr. Cartland, the Honest Doctor. Labelled as an anti-vaxxer despite being vaccinated, portrayed as a bully for fighting to protect human rights and patient autonomy, dismissed as a conspiracy theorist for daring to question the medical profession using peer-reviewed research and data. Dr. David Cartland destroyed his medical career for daring to question and speak out during the COVID-19 pandemic. David is a happily married family man who enjoys spending time with his wife and children. He's a father of 4 incredible children and fur father to his flock of 5 dogs. David is an avid football fan and recently retired as a player after 32 years playing grassroots football, transitioning into a referee as soon as his boots were hung up, and has already been promoted and enjoys this immensely. He's a passionate Aston Villa fan, and until he relocated to Cornwall 5 years ago, enjoyed the pilgrimage to Villa Park often. David has a strong family ethos underpinned by a strong personal Christian faith. His hobbies outside of health coaching are literature, recently writing his own narration of recent events in a cathartic, poetic and prose format, and has recently been given bestseller status in a number of categories on Amazon Books. He also enjoys reading himself and follows a wide range of diverse authors, but specifically enjoys biographies and crime mysteries such as Harlan Coben. He enjoys horror movies and the occasional rom-com. He takes full advantage of his location in the deep southwest of Cornwall, regularly taking to the multitude of beaches and coastal paths to relax, keep fit, and take in the amazing views on offer. Plus, it's a wonderful place to walk his dogs. Now, David Cartland has positioned himself as a whistleblower who was struck off for raising concerns about patient safety due to the COVID vaccines, which he feels were not only useless, but also harmful and damaging to all who took them. A recent interview with UK Column stated, Dr. Cartland was struck off the medical register after a tribunal hearing at the end of 2025. He describes his punishments and treatment as a witch hunt, one he says he has endured at the hands of the General Medical Council and other authorities since becoming a COVID whistleblower in 2021. However, despite the best efforts of the authorities to silence him and to destroy his life, Dr. Cartland says that he will continue to speak truth to power and fight for justice. So what does Google AI say about him? It says that following a Medical Practitioner Tribunal service, an MPTS hearing, that concluded on the 26th of June 2025, Mr. Cartland was removed from the medical register with immediate effect. The reasons for this erasure were that the tribunal found him guilty of serious professional misconduct, including the persistent harassment of 4 medical colleagues on social media platforms. He was also found to have acted dishonestly by offering to provide COVID-19 exemption certificates to individuals regardless of whether they had a genuine medical reason or not. He currently provides health and well-being advice through his website, The Honest Doctor, explicitly stating that he is a non-GMC registered healthcare advisor. Dr. Cartland gained a significant social media following for his vocal opposition to the official COVID-19 narrative, which he has referred to as a scamdemic. He qualified in 2008 from Birmingham Medical School and became a GP in 2014. His experience includes working in A&E and out-of-hours urgent care and homeless outreach services in Cornwall. He describes himself as a courageous whistleblower who risked his career to question the safety of COVID-19 vaccines and the official health policies at the time. In late 2025, he published a book titled Do No Harm, which documents his frontline experiences during the pandemic and his perspective on the events that led to his removal from the medical register. The tribunal panel concluded that Dr. Cartland's actions were fundamentally incompatible with continued registration. Specific findings included the use of abusive language towards colleagues, such as evil witch and malicious scumbags, posting content found to be hostile towards the LGBTQ+ community, and encouraging followers to harass other medical professionals. In recent public statements following his removal from the medical register, David Cartland has started to pivot towards more exotic areas of the conspiracy world, including out-and-out virus denialism and terrain theory. And his current stance has recently included the following claims. There was no isolated COVID virus. And that's right. Cartland has claimed that no virus, including SARS-CoV-2, has ever been properly isolated or proven to exist according to scientific gold standards. And he's also started to move away from conventional germ theory, which states that pathogens cause disease, in favor of terrain theory. And this is an alternative belief that suggests that disease is merely a result of the body's internal environment, such as the toxicity or poor nutrition, rather than external factors. Now, he bounces around with a lot of theories, and it's probably fairer to say that he entertains those things rather than actively believes them, but he certainly has spoken about them. And so terrain theory, this started because the idea is that on his deathbed, Louis Pasteur said that his idea about germs was wrong and that all his experimentation was incorrect. And that a rival, Antoine Beauchamp, was actually correct. So what supposedly happened is that as he was dying, Louis Pasteur basically denounced everything that he'd always said. And the actual quote that is given for this situation was that the microbe is nothing, Beauchamp was correct. And the source for this is, well, it originally started as an anecdote published by a man called Paul Bourget in an issue of the 1922 magazine Illustration. That's my flawless French there. Professor Renan, who has just died prematurely, told me that watching Pasteur during his last illness, the latter, who he thought was asleep, had woken up from an indefinite recollection to tell him, Renard, it is Bernard who was right. The germ is nothing. The terrain is everything. And the story gained significant traction in the 20th century through books like Beauchamp or Pasteur, a lost chapter in the history of biology, which came out in 1923, was authored by Ethel Douglas Hume. And this book framed Louis Pasteur as a scientific fraud who privately doubted his own theories and knew them to be not true. In 1955, a book called The Private Science of Louis Pasteur by Gerald Geisen is often cited in these debates because it revealed Pasteur's private laboratory notes. Although Geisen himself focused on Pasteur's experimental ethics rather than a literal deathbed recantation. But the quote and the idea that Pasteur doubted his own work has come from these sources. But unfortunately, it's a complete and total lie. I mean, aside from anything else, that's simply not how things work. We've said things like this before, but if on his deathbed, Steve Jobs had said, the iPhone doesn't really work, it wouldn't have altered how your iPhone works. Because, and I'll say again, that's not how anything works in the real world. Anyway, in The Life of Pasteur by Valéry Radin, which came out in 1902, and this is the definitive biography written by Pasteur's son-in-law, it describes Pasteur's final hours in detail, stating that his last whispered word was yes, which was in response to a question from his wife. It doesn't contain anything connected to the terrain theory confession. So that is just, it's a silly nonsense, but it's been picked up by contrarians within the conspiracy world that think that, there's a great big fraud, and like essentially boils down to the idea of self-healing and such like that. But he's also started talking about the possibility of what some people have called exosome theory. Now, exosome theory came from a disgraced psychiatrist from New York who his career was doing pretty badly. His Google reviews were saying that he was dreadful, but then he stumbled across something. He decided that an exosome under a microscope, he thought that was what people had been mistaking viruses for. Exosomes are basically like a sort of communication cell. They work around the body, like sending messages and such like that. Scientists know exactly what they are and how they're distinct from viruses, but for whatever reason, the internet jumped on Andrew Kaufman, saying that COVID didn't exist because no viruses existed. And his proof of this was a picture of what he took, an exosome. And it was a circular thing with like little bits of dots around it, almost like satellites around a planet. And he spotted that this looked rather similar to the circular with spikes coming out of it impression that we'd been given of SARS-CoV-2. And so he made the conclusion that they were the same thing and that viruses didn't exist. This was rather embarrassing because the picture that he used to show the fact that viruses didn't exist showed an exosome next to a Guillain-Barré virus. So the man knew absolutely nothing, but he was able to fleece a huge amount of people. He was charging $1,000 for a 20-minute Skype call during which he would remove your exosomes over Skype, thus making you safe. I actually emailed him and said that I thought I had COVID, and he came back to me and said, well, don't go to hospital. What you need to do is you need to book in £1,000 call with me and I'll, get rid of your exosomes, which if I'd have been telling the truth would have been absolutely terrible advice. He spent all his money that he made on this on a really, really bad hair transplant. But this is the sort of thing that was happening at COVID. And this ties into David Cartland because he started to say that the entire COVID-19 pandemic was a scamdemic. In his recent book, the 2025 release, Do No Harm, he labels the COVID-19 pandemic as fake and says that the idea of a new virus was a complete fabrication simply used to drive vaccine uptake. So the virus didn't exist, and the whole point of it was to get everyone vaccinated. Now, again, this is not his own idea either. He stole this concept from a lady called Judy Mikovits, a woman that claimed that essentially all illness is caused by dormant mice retroviruses and that vaccines are used in order to deliver these to people. She also thinks that masks cause hypoxia, which is you suffocating to death, and that by wearing a mask, you activate your own dormant viruses by breathing them in and out. And this concentrates the virus until you get ill from, in her own words, your own internal expressions. The other thing that Cartland has started to do is started promoting all sorts of detox protocols. Now, detoxing isn't really a thing. People that say that we can remove toxins from you or heavy metals from you and this type of thing, ear candles, those sock things that draw poison out through the soles of your feet, it's total quackery. It is not a thing. Do you know how you detox yourself from toxins? You have a liver and a kidney and kidneys. That's it. Anything else is completely superfluous and it's just woo. But he's also started to align himself with people like Russell Brand, the alleged sex pest, and Alex Balefield, the recently re-jailed stalker who harassed a series of people over about a decade. Now, Mr. Cartland has said that in the tribunal where he got struck off, he didn't really get a fair go. He said that the statements and the tweets that he made and his arguments about the COVID protocols were always presented without context and presented in such a way that were designed to make him look bad or to make him look foolish, and he wasn't able to rebut his arguments. He also claims that all the so-called harassment that he was accused of was essentially retaliatory, and that he was just involved in robust arguments on the internet. And I believe he described Twitter as like a bear pit or something like that. And so it's just the rough and tumble of being involved. He said that he only wanted to stick to his Hippocratic oath and to help people. And that's why he decided to be a whistleblower against the COVID protocols and to call out what he, as a professional, could see was happening to the world. So we have two stories there. One, where he is essentially the aggressor, and then his take on it, where he is being persecuted because he's trying to expose a great harm that governments, institutions, the Illuminati, whoever is imposing on the population. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look. We're going to see what happened. We're going to see what he believes. We're going to see what he said, and we're going to see what the results of his actions were. And the interesting thing about this is that, well, two things. One, every single thing that we're about to talk about over this series is in the public domain. We've not snooped around or done anything like that. We've looked at the tribunal, and we've looked at Cartland's interactions with other people on Twitter. We've also paid attention to his website. We've listened to a lot of interviews that he's done. And so we want to be very fair in trying to get across what he was trying to say. And the second point is that whether Cartland is correct or whether Cartland is incorrect, this is a fascinating story that is definitely in the public interest, because either it exposes somebody that was at the very top of his profession, you know, a GP, and apparently a very good and qualified GP, who has either discovered something appalling that the government, the medical establishment, and various other institutions has tried to cover up and has been persecuted for it, or alternatively, this is a GP that for whatever reason has gone down the rabbit hole to his own detriment. And whichever of those stories happens to be the case is fascinating. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and determine what the facts are about this. Is Cartland a whistleblower that's been unfairly chastised? Or, as the tribunal found, did he go down a rabbit hole and decide that this justified some pretty appalling behavior? Well, let's find out. The timeline starts in 2008 with David Cartland obtaining his primary medical qualification and becoming a doctor from the University of Birmingham. In 2014, David Cartland registered as a GP. What exactly Mr. Cartland was doing when he was a GP during COVID is not entirely clear. Other GPs were obviously running around trying to give people vaccines and such, but Mr. Cartland apparently was far more skeptical. In 2026, on Twitter, he claimed, "As a doctor, I never promoted, offered, or administered a COVID-19 bioweapon shot to a single human being, ever. How many others in the UK can say that?" In January 2021, there was some very sad news. Unfortunately, a friend of David Cartland's, who he will later describe as his best friend, died from COVID. And this sounds like an absolutely tragic story. And it was reported in the Daily Mail under the headline, "Mother, 38, dies from COVID after telling her husband and 5-year-old son she loved them." And this is absolutely tragic. The lady in question fell ill on Christmas Day. She went to hospital the following day at like 1 a.m. and Boxing Day, so very early, middle of the night, essentially. And she was so ill that she spent 12 days in hospital on a ventilator before very sadly passing away due to COVID. And this must be horrible. Like so many people at the time, horrible things were happening. And a lot of people didn't really cope very well with the whole premise. There was other conspiracy theorists that went down the viruses don't exist route, or decided the whole thing was fake. There was one who famously had essentially a nervous breakdown and recorded himself crying and screaming in a car because he'd been asked to follow a queue around a post office, and he was equating this to gulag-like tyranny. And the reason that people didn't cope well with it was the isolation and the uncertainty, the lack of control. A lot of people went a little doolally. And this is interesting because, you know, not to sort of like harp on, but like people were saying that this was always the dream of the conspiracy world, was it? I just want a log cabin in the woods away from everyone. I don't want to speak to anybody. I just want to be on my own, which is fine if that's what you decide. But when it's imposed on you, it's essentially torture. And I'm not even joking. Like isolation, sticking people in isolated cells and such like that, it can send you mad. It can literally send you mad. The fact that basically anybody could die, anybody could get ill, nobody knew what the consequences were. Long COVID, for example. Was the economy going to collapse? Were we going to be locked down forever and not be able to see friends and family? It was a horrible time for everybody. And what the human brain tends to want to do in situations like that, where there's uncertainty, is they like to get a degree of control back by coming up with a scenario. And so a lot of people pretended that this was obviously an Illuminati plot, that maybe the virus was fake, maybe it was something else that was killing people, like 5G, but it was definitely coordinated. There was a plot, there was a reason and a rhyme behind this. Like, as Cartland said, it was to get people vaccinated. A lot of people thought that it was to get people onto some sort of digital ID that would have been introduced as a vaccine passport. Why would people do this? Because, bizarrely, at least someone's got a hand on the tiller in regards to that. If there's a targeted plot, if somebody's going after you, then it means that basically there's this degree of certainty. Whereas if this is just a random disease that could pick off anybody unfairly, chaotically, then what do you do with it? It's like the Alan Moore quote, where he says, like, conspiracy theorists, when they realize that the world is actually chaotic, there is no Illuminati, there are no lizard people, nobody's steering the ship. That's actually more terrifying. And it's far nearer to the truth. And so we've got to take that on board, because a lot of people, as I say, decided that they wanted to look for alternative ideas, alternative explanations and alternative answers. And I think that may be what happened in regards to Cartland. We don't know, but a lot of people were looking for answers, and they were rejecting the mainstream answers because they didn't trust the government, and they didn't trust the medical establishment because they felt that the medical establishment was in some way an extension of the government. So one of the people that first came up with an answer was an osteopath called Sherry Tenpenny. Do you remember her, Brent?
Sure do.
She goes by doctor, but she's a doctor of osteopathy. So I don't know. You know, I think she's a doctor in the same way that I'm a reverend. You know, I've got a certificate that says it, but, you know. So in June 2021, a Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, an American osteopath and anti-vaccine activist, testified before the Ohio House Health Committee. During her testimony, she claimed that COVID-19 vaccines could cause people to become magnetized, magnetic, allowing metal objects like keys and spoons to stick to their skin. Shortly after, a second video from the same hearing went viral, which showed a nurse attempting to demonstrate this by trying to stick a key to her chest and her neck, but unfortunately, they kept falling off. But in February 2022, David Cartland tweeted, "Can anyone please help me explain why me and all my neighbors, my wife and my good friends have magnets sticking to our arms, please?" And this is accompanied by 3 pictures of what appear to be bits of arms. And there are, I don't know whether they're magnets or those type of batteries that you used to get in handheld games, but they're stuck to people's arms. And Cartland also posted a video in which he showed himself to be magnetic and explained it.
One more. Just giving you a quick video to show regarding a previous post on Twitter that magnets are indeed sticking to people with, well, I'm not going to even speculate to say it's anything to do with the jab, but people are sticking to magnets, let's say. Put some magnets on the advice of a GP practicing in the Midlands who said he was basically sticking these to all of his patients, receptionists, junior doctors, some student doctors. Thought he was a complete lunatic until I bought some of these. And anyway, my friend was around at the time, my wife was here, and long story short, stuck to us all, stuck to our neighbours, and I'll show you now. So I'm just going to do a quick negative control, if you like. So, in fact, I'll demonstrate the magnet quickly. So, pop it in the palm of my hand, as you can see, it shoots straight onto the end of the magnet. Take one. Just going to show you, it's in a bit of an awkward position, my magnetic spot, but I'm just going to show you, see where the line is. I'm just going to put it somewhere else, just so you can see that it's not doing much as I rub it along the surface. It's not doing any repelling. Straight to the spot, if it's the right way around. Took a little bit of convincing there, but anyway, long story short, give it a bit of a shake. Give it a lot of a shake. Turn my arm around, just so you can see it's pretty stuck there. And the interesting thing is that when you turn it around, it actually repels the magnet. You can't see that very well on video, but it's literally pushing the magnet away. I'll just show you again because it's a bit awkward first time round. Pop it on there, and there she sticks. Be really, really happy to hear from any physicists. I'm not a physicist. Anyone who can explain why my arm is stuck to a magnet. Any suggestions gratefully received, and I promise you I'm not going mad. Have a great day, everyone.
I mean, I'm not a physicist, not full-time, not professional anyway, but it's due to sticky skin. Essentially, it's just due to the natural oils in your skin. Like if you washed that bit of your arm and tried again, you'd find that there wasn't sufficient adhesion to keep it there. It's not because you've got a magnet inside you, nor because you've become magnetic. It's just a thing that happens. Anyway, also in February 2022, he releases his Breaking the Silence document, and this was released on Substack. This was a document in which he basically explained his position and why he was speaking up about what he described as institutional corruption and censorship within the NHS. And the NHS is the National Health Service for anyone listening to us overseas. And in this, he claims that his best friend, the lady we spoke of, sadly died of COVID. But he complains that the Nightingale hospitals were never full. And if anyone, and he's absolutely right about this, because the Nightingale hospitals were performative nonsense by the government, who were not really trying to deal with the COVID pandemic. They were running 2 campaigns. They were saying what they needed to say to the public, and then they were essentially trying to make the country take it on the chin and just get on with it. And this was at the behest of the Treasury, various business magnates, people from the oil industry, because lockdowns and the threat of lockdowns had sent oil into negative equity, and bizarrely media magnates who wanted people commuting and buying newspapers. So the Nightingale hospitals were these great big tents, essentially, that were set up, temporary hospitals that were set up basically in parks and car parks. And Mr. Cartland is absolutely correct about the fact that they weren't used because they didn't have any staff for them. So it was a huge waste of money. It was just very, very stupid. But the government being stupid doesn't mean that COVID didn't happen. But in this document, the Breaking the Silence document, he claims that all the deaths that were attributed to COVID were basically all you needed was a positive test, and it had no bearing on whether COVID actually killed you or not. And this is also not true. And people will cite, but I saw it on the news. They said that any death up to 28 days after that will be considered COVID. And by that, you could fudge all the numbers, and anybody who died of anything but was connected in any way to a positive test could be described as a COVID death. And in that way that they could bolster up the numbers and they could fudge it and to make it look like a lot more people died. And he also claims that this was done with PCR tests, which can be manipulated by raising the number of cycles. Now, this is not true. The first thing is that the reason they tracked the number of deaths connected to 28 days was because they wanted to see if there's any patterns in the way that the pandemic was moving. That was the figure that was shown on the news, but that was not the figure that was recording the actual deaths, because what they did afterwards was they went back and they looked at the number of deaths that had a COVID positive test, and they looked at the death certificate and the circumstances around the death, and it was only the figure, which I forget exactly what it was, but it was north of 250,000 people. The final death count wasn't taken from that 28 days list. It was taken from people that it was proven on their death certificates that COVID had been the contributing factor to their death. And you know what? That number ended up being higher than the number that they showed on the news. So let's take that to its logical conclusion. If, as the conspiracy theorists are claiming, they were hyping up the numbers, let's take that as read. They were hyping up the numbers. Explain to me why they used the lowest metric. There were at least 2 counts that were higher than the count that was shown on the news. Surely, if they wanted to induce panic, then they should have used the highest possible figure. It may have looked to people that didn't understand how the figures were recorded that by having that margin of 28 days, that was bound to accumulate far more, but it didn't. So that doesn't hold up. Also, this thing about you can raise the number of cycles, it's just absolutely not true. It's a misunderstanding about the difference between something called CT and cycle rate. And the long and short of it is that it's not true. And if it was true, show me. Show me. You get something, okay, get like a house brick or something like that. Use a PCR test on it, hype up the cycles and find Ebola in it. Because according to you, you can find anything in it. Or find COVID in it. Find COVID in something that shouldn't have COVID by ramping up the cycles. When you can demonstrate that, I'll believe you. Until then, I'll just realize that you've misunderstood how these tests work. He then basically says that Kary Mullis, who is the inventor of the PCR test, he himself, who died apparently suspiciously just before COVID, he didn't. He died of pneumonia after a lifetime of drug abuse. But let's not get bogged down in facts. So in the Substack, Cartland writes, with some prior knowledge of this from my science background and an early statement from the inventor of PCR, Kary Mullis himself, stating that this was not a technology purposed for diagnostics of viral infections. So we can see the argument that Cartland is making. He said that basically, like, they're hyping up the figures, and to do this, they're using a PCR test, which is cycled to a point where it'll give you a positive for absolutely anything. But to further compound that, the PCR shouldn't be used to diagnose. And there's an element of truth in this, because diagnose is a phrase that means a complete understanding of the disease and its parameters and how bad it is and whatnot, and etc. That's what it technically means. What diagnose can be used to mean in a sort of, talking parlance as opposed to scientific is, have you got it or not? And so that phrase is mashed up. It doesn't matter anyway, because this is directly from the patent. The patent written by Carrie Mullis. Various infectious diseases can be diagnosed by the presence in clinical samples of specific DNA sequences characteristic of the causative microorganism. These include bacteria such as Salmonella, Chlamydia, and Neisseria, viruses such as hepatitis viruses, and parasites such as Plasmodium. The use of specific DNA hybridization probes for the diagnosis of infectious diseases. And it goes on to say, routine clinical use of DNA probes for the diagnosis of infectious diseases would be simplified considerably if non-radioactively labeled probes could be employed as described. So that's not true either. So whilst one could understand that position and that argument and understand where Cartland is coming from, unfortunately, the three principles that underpin his argument are misunderstandings or misrepresentations of what he's read. Anyway, he goes on and he says he moans that all the positive patients that he saw were vaccinated, which means that the vaccine doesn't work. But here's the thing, they all survived. But also, I didn't think there was a disease, because I thought it was just the PCR being manipulated. So that's somewhat incoherent. He then says that the data that had just come out of Scotland indicated that if you looked at vaccinated people versus unvaccinated people, at the time, the data suggested that there were more deaths in the cohort of vaccinated people than there were in the unvaccinated people. And this, again, is taken to mean that, well, hang on, there's a correlation there, isn't there? And it's not a silly point. It's something that requires looking at. Now, the explanation for that was that would rapidly change. And if you looked back at it now, it's very clear that the unvaccinated were far more likely to die. But at that point, because we're in early 2022, so at this point, the people who were likely to be vaccinated were the people who needed vaccinating, people that were ill or had prior comorbidities, or the elderly. So people that felt that they needed more protection, but were also sadly had a lot more health problems. Some of that potentially exacerbated by COVID, some of it just happenstance that this eventually killed them. But it's one of those things where, there is an explanation for that doesn't mean that the vaccine is killing them. Now, rather worryingly, because at this point, Mr. Cartland was still a general practitioner. I think he'd stopped working at the vaccine centre. But in this Substack, he seems to doubt the idea of asymptomatic spread. And he writes in the Substack, respiratory viruses such as SARS-CoV-19 are spread not by asymptomatic carriers as previously covered, because he's previously spoken about in this thing about a sneeze. How would a virus be transported by a sneeze? And if you've got a virus, you know you've got a virus because you feel ill. And that's quite shocking for a GP to say. Because it's very famous cases, Typhoid Mary obviously being the classic case. This poor woman asymptomatically gave lots of people typhus and killed them. I mean, HIV is another one. There's a lot of people that have asymptomatic to that and don't realize they've got it until their partner or previous partner or whatever goes for an STI test, realizes that they're HIV positive themselves and have to track it back to their previous partners. We've all been in scenarios where you've been at the office or you've been at work or whatever, you've been out with some friends, Janet's got a bit of a sniffle or whatever, and you think nothing of it. The next day, she's not in work. 3 days later, you're not in work. So at which point, do you see what I mean? There must have been a period where you were infected but weren't showing symptoms. There's a misunderstanding about what symptoms are. Symptoms are your body's reaction to the disease. They're caused by your body trying to fight the disease off, or the virus off, or the condition off, or whatever. So it's a very, very silly position for somebody that is a general practitioner to have. And it's curious to know at this point whether he believes that or whether he's just saying it. But I'm going to go with, I think he's believed it, because I think he's convinced himself. I think he's reading these papers and such. And I think that he's a doctor. He knows what he's talking about. And they're presented in such a way that they appear plausible. And fine, that's okay. It's a debate. We didn't know what we know now. Also, at the time, these are arguments that are being presented that he's saying, I think this is possible. I think this is plausible. And that's a perfectly fair position to be in. But he was convinced of the vaccine being dangerous because someone he knew had developed arthritis almost directly after having the vaccine. He writes, my individual experience of seeing very odd post-vaccination reactions came ironically around the time of my second jab. In just 1 week, I saw a terrible case of a very fit gentleman who was suddenly unable to move his hands and feet and became swollen, a reactive arthritis coming inexplicably on without any prior rheumatological history. This was 2 days after his vaccine. A couple I did a home visit on came out with the most bizarre skin rash and large ulcers appearing widespread to the body, the like of which I have never seen. Again, this was within a week of the jab, and they had no prior history of skin problems. Another patient developed skin ulcers, and so this is what he's said. And I mean, studies since then have shown that, who knows? Maybe that was correct. Maybe he did see somebody that had a reaction to it that caused some sort of autoimmune response that had a sort of arthritis thing. What's the one that's the osteo? One of them is an immune thing, isn't it? It's not just your joints like grinding, like one of the sort of joint pain things. I forget which one. So maybe. I mean, studies have shown that basically the rate of arthritis is the same as it was before, during, and after COVID, but potentially he did see that. He was also worried by the video that was circulating of all the athletes dropping dead. Do you remember this at all, Brent? There was plenty of videos that were flying around.
There are so many. All of these
people, just
athletes collapsing and having like heart problems and
there were. There was footballers that had cardiac arrest and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And this was a thing. Now, the problem was that essentially it was just drawn into sharp focus. David writes, aside from this, more worrying observations from different arenas. As an avid football and sports fan, reports of footballers dropping like flies, some live on TV, and numerous tennis stars falling ill during games. And this again was this video circulating. Now, if you go and basically, if you look it up, the FA basically says that I think it's something around the region of about 400 young athletes a year have problems with cardiac arrest. It's just a thing. You can find articles in The Guardian talking about this problem as early as like 2007. It's a bizarre phenomenon where sometimes the fittest people push their bodies to breaking point, essentially. Now, the other problem with the video that was circulating, the one that Cartland was referring to, was that nobody in the video died. A lot of the athletes that were collapsing were before COVID, and I think it was something like 90% of them were attributed to dehydration. So they knew who all the athletes were in these videos. I mean, we shan't bore you by going through every single one, but you can look that up if you want. But the long and short of it is that all of these videos of people collapsing, comedians collapsing, newsreaders collapsing, all of this, none of them died, and none of it was connected to the vaccine. But bizarrely, Cartland recommends, and this is where his position is not entirely clear, because he's trying to say that COVID doesn't really exist, but that he's seen some people with COVID. There's already certain things that are not clear, but he starts to recommend zinc, vitamin D, and ivermectin for the treatment or the prevention of COVID, none of which have been proven to help with COVID in any way. And ironically, in this Substack, he keeps asking for data to prove that COVID or SARS-CoV-2 is dangerous and that the vaccines are safe. Data which is available, but he doesn't appear to want to look at, particularly at that time. But he promotes what could be described as quack medicines like ivermectin and zinc and vitamin D as genuine sort of help during this particular time, when there's absolutely no data to support that. And again, I think that speaks to, as we spoke before, the sort of confirmation bias of people wanting there to be answers or wanting there to be. And I think this is, again, it's more a case at the moment where I think he's, as just because he's a doctor, I think he's as susceptible to stress as anybody else, and is finding this information, which is seemingly coming from people who know what they're talking about. It gives an alternative explanation to the government, who we don't trust because they have a track record of being untrustworthy. And many people found themselves in this position. On the 16th of February 2022, he appeared on the Lawrence Fox podcast internet show. It was called Reclaim the Media. I'm not even sure if Fox is doing it anymore, but it was called Reclaim the Media, and Dr. Cartland was interviewed on this, and he goes on there and basically says unequivocally that the COVID vaccine is not safe. Not only is it not any use, it is harmful. And Lawrence Fox reads the entire Breaking the Silence document, and Cartland goes on to claim that the vaccines were not safe because they were issued under emergency authorization. And again, this potentially raises something that requires examination, a concern. Now, I looked into this, and what do you think emergency authorization actually means?
I think it sounds like there's if an emergency breaks out, you know, we need to throw every single fucking thing at it. So like rigorous testing.
Yes, exactly that. Basically, it doesn't mean that they weren't tested in the same way as other vaccines. It just, what it actually did was reduce the need to secure funding and volunteers between phases. And bizarrely, like some of the testing for COVID vaccines were some of the most tested vaccines ever, because there was a huge amount of people that had the time suddenly to do it and felt that they wanted to get involved. Now, what the emergency authorization in real terms allowed was for them to stockpile the vaccine, be making it and stockpile it ready to go at the very second that it passed the end of the phase 3 test. Because normally what they'd have to do is they'd have to do the tests and then go out and secure the funding to make them, convince the government that they wanted them, and then start to make them. What the emergency authorization did was like say that you can start to make it so that when it is proven to be safe, when it has gone through the exact same standards as every other medicine that goes to market, then you'll have some ready. And it's that aspect of it that was cut out. On the 18th of February, so just 2 days later, he appears on Iconic. Iconic, if people don't know, is the platform owned by David Icke and the Icke family. And he's being interviewed by Gareth Icke. And at this point, we can presume he's not working as a doctor anymore, because he says that he resigned his position as a GP due to the UK government's handling of the COVID crisis. He says that he saw from the start that things weren't actually that bad. The disease wasn't really that harmful. It wasn't affecting anybody other than the very, very ill. And he didn't actually see anybody that was ill. He didn't see anyone that was ill, which somewhat contradicts what he's previously said about, seeing ill people. I mean, the argument is that, like, well, if you've resigned as a GP and we're at lockdown, where would you expect to see somebody that was ill? And again, he might well be the case. Oh, I've not seen anybody that's ill. Well, I mean, where have you been? Have you been in an A&E like ward or anything like that? No. So fair enough. He also says that the vaccines don't work because they don't stop you from catching COVID or from getting ill. Can you see the contradiction there? Because he's literally just said that no one's getting ill and that it's not that serious. So again, it's a little bit all over the place. But again, if you remember at the time, it depends how unkind you want to be. If you want to be kind, basically everyone was looking for answers and like scrabbling around. If you want to be slightly unkind, certain people within the conspiracy world had already decided what it was and were looking desperately to fit the pieces to their pre-existing narrative. Hey ho. Now, the main sort of crux of the interview is that he claims to have seen all sorts of vaccine injuries, and he says that tiredness, certain skin conditions, like he's already discussed. He says that he's even seen cancers and deaths, but he says that he hasn't actually seen any COVID, which contradicts his previous statement about the vaccinated getting ill, which contradicts his previous statement about NOS. Let's not get tied up in that. He says that the only people dying were the old, infirm, or obese, which contradicts the previous statement, which we've just said contradicts the previous. This is like a Russian doll of contradictions. But anyway, he says, and this is a point that was, again, one of the sort of major bones of contention around COVID. He says that the only people that are dying were the old, infirm, or the obese, and that the average age of death was actually higher than the average life expectancy. And this is something that I saw one of the smart people arguing about the other day, saying that, like, it's all lies, blah, 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 and like nobody died and whatnot. And it's like, we must remember at this point as well that David's friend died, his apparent best friend, although after 2023, he started saying that she was murdered by doctors using midazolam and morphine, which depends how you want to look at it. That's, it's not really likely, but I just think that's somebody who's hurting, looking for answers, basically. You could make the argument that probably shouldn't use your friend's death in this manner. It could be seen as exploitative by some, but each to their own. Anyway, so this average age of death was higher than the average life expectancy, which sounds scary. In fact, it sounds the opposite of scary. It sounds, oh, thank God. So does this mean that basically, like, the only people that were dying were people that, like, oh, come on, dude, you've been on this ride for longer than you were expected to be anyway? No, it's not what it means. In several regions, the average age of death involving COVID-19 was indeed higher than the average life expectancy at birth. But this is primarily because COVID-19 mortality risks increase exponentially with age. So, in the United Kingdom, in 2020, the median age of death involving COVID-19 in England and Wales was 83 years old. At the time, life expectancy at birth was approximately 79 years for a man and 83 years for females. In Scotland, reports from late 2020 showed that the average age of COVID death was 79 for men and 84 for women, while life expectancy is 77 for males and 81 for females. So in both cases, the life expectancy is lower than the average death. A study of 8 countries, including the USA, Germany, and Italy, found that approximately 65% of COVID-19 deaths occurred at ages above the respective countries' life expectancy. So does that mean that it was nothing to worry about? Not really. It's about how these statistics work, right? So while these averages might suggest that the victims were past their time, health experts emphasize 2 critical points. One, And this sounds contradictory, but life expectancy increases with age. So life expectancy at birth is an average pulled down by those who die young. Okay, so because people die as babies, the possibility of dying at babies is higher than nothing, say, for example. So a person who's already reached the age of 80 has a much higher remaining life expectancy, say potentially 7 to 9 years, than a newborn, if that makes sense. So in the UK, it was estimated that individuals who died from COVID-19 lost an average of 10.2 years of life that they would have otherwise lived. So statistics, yada, 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 what it means, it doesn't mean what you think it means. Most of the people that died from COVID would have had at least 10 years more to live. Some of them would have had significantly more than that. For example, David's friend, who was only 38. In 31 countries studied, more than 28 million years of life were lost. This was in 31 countries. In 2020 alone, 28 million years of life were lost because of COVID. In the United States, mortality increases in the under 60 age group contributed most significantly to the decline in overall life expectancy. So large life expectancy losses in the US and parts of Eastern Europe were driven by deaths among people in the 45 to 74 age bracket, which is, apart from in certain countries, that is all below the expected lifespan. So does that make sense? Did you see what I mean? They're basically like, it's really down to statistics. And the problem with COVID is that what it did as well was it significantly reduced the life expectancy in most countries due to a number of factors, essentially. But that is a statistical misunderstanding. Like, as I said, people lost about 10 years of life. And to be honest, it's really a moot point. It's like, oh, well, most people died that were, older than life expectancy anyway. It's like, oh, well, that makes me feel far better about my auntie. I suddenly don't care. Oh, no, wait, that's not how anything works. Anyway, now, at this point, Cartland says, and he's on Iconic, remember, with Garth, that he's desperately tried to debate his colleagues at work about all of the things that he's brought up in his Breaking the Silence and in these interviews and such like that, but they are dismissive to him. And he says that he's being bullied because of his opinions. And it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, that may well be true. It could just be that basically, like, you're wrong, or they think you're wrong, and that you just don't take being told that you're wrong very well for whatever reason. I'm not saying that it's like, because that takes away your psychological comfort, because that takes away your certainty and your sort of like, your base of operations, so to speak, mentally. But both he and Gareth's big gripe is that the people giving the vaccines don't explain the possible chances of side effects, and that you can't refuse the vaccine once you've actually turned up for your appointment. And the thing about that is that neither of those things are even remotely true. I mean, Gareth's not been vaccinated. I've had this argument with so many people. Oh, that you were sacked. There was no way of avoiding the vaccine. Did you get the vaccine? No, I mean, I didn't get the vaccine. I said, well, I thought you just said that there was absolutely no way of avoiding it. And also this idea that they didn't explain the possible chances of the side effects. I don't know about you, but I had to read a form that explained how, like, chances 1 in 25,000, whatever, of myocarditis, pericarditis, stroke, death, etc., etc., etc. I had to sign that twice, I think, before they allowed me to do it. And then when I went into the doctor's office where they administered it, there was a similar form on the wall that they asked me to read again. I don't know if you had a similar experience, Brent.
The first half, sure, not the second half. Mine was at like a Boots vaccination center.
Fair
But
enough.
yeah, we were told about it. I was given like an insert that had all
Yeah.
of the side effects and ingredients and everything like that with it. Like, was very informed about everything.
Were you made to sit and wait for 15 to 20 minutes after your jab to make
Yes.
sure? So yeah, again, to make sure that there were no, immediate adverse effects, and that if you were, you could be dealt with. So that's just simply not true. And I don't understand why that has become such a big trope. What was interesting was that recently people released a load of fake consent forms that basically said, there was a line on there that said something along the line of, if you die, you can't sue us, or something like that. And these were fabricated. This was like, it was like a 4chan Reddit creation or something like that. But people were putting this around. It's like, but your entire argument was that there was no informed consent. Now you're saying that the informed consent wrapped you up in a sort of legal way. And it just. But they go on to say that basically the COVID vaccine has caused massive amounts of deaths, and that this is shown in Pfizer's own data. And also that the 1976 swine flu vaccine was pulled from the market after causing as little as 50 deaths. So why isn't the COVID vaccine being pulled from the market? And what they're insinuating is that this is evidence of a plot, that this is the point. It's there to kill you, and that's why it's not being taken off the market, because it's doing exactly what they want it to do. So this comes from a document that was circulating in 2022. Claims regarding massive deaths from Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine primarily originated from a misrepresentation of a specific post-authorization safety report that Pfizer was ordered to release by a US court. And this is Pfizer document 536. The primary document cited was cumulative analysis of post-authorization adverse events report received through 28th of February 2021. So the claim that they're talking about here is, and this is backed up by lots of like social media posts and articles, said that this report showed 1,223 deaths and over 42,000 adverse events shortly after the vaccine rollout, alleging that Pfizer and the FDA tried to hide this massive amount of deaths. Now, the reality is that these figures represented spontaneous reports of health events that occurred after vaccination and not deaths. So the misunderstanding stemmed from a lack of context regarding how safety monitoring works. There was something which is called passive surveillance. So the 1,223 deaths were adverse events reported to Pfizer's safety database from around the world. In such databases, any death occurring after vaccination is recorded regardless of the cause: car accidents, underlying illnesses, or natural causes, to help researchers look for unusual patterns. The 1,223 deaths, though they were spread across 63 countries, and they included car accidents, suicides, natural causes, murders. Now, isn't that ironic? Because that's what they've claimed they were doing with the COVID figures, which they weren't. But that's what they're doing with these figures to prove that the vaccine is dangerous. So, Pfizer's report explicitly stated that many external factors influence whether an event is reported, and that the data does not establish a causal relationship. At the time of the report, tens of millions of doses had already been administered, often to elderly or high-risk populations, where a certain number of natural deaths are statistically expected. So out of the tens of millions of doses, they reported just over 1,000 deaths, spread over 63 countries, and none of these deaths were connected to the vaccine. Now, similar massive death claims, basically in the UK and America, use the US Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, and the UK's Yellow Card scheme. Both systems allow anyone to report a health issue after vaccination, which does not prove the vaccine was the cause. There used to be a fabulous Twitter guy called, was it Batshit Vares? And one of the claims was that the man, after having his vaccination, had turned green and swollen to 3 or 4 times his normal size, breaking out of his clothes and going on a rampage that he claimed that he turned into the Incredible Hulk. And that was taken seriously by VAERS because they report anything. Most of the adverse effects were a sore arm, but it looks scary when it's lumped all together, basically. The UK's yellow card scheme was exactly the same. Like people, there was one where somebody had claimed, after the vaccination, I was completely full of eels. You know, the swimmy things, the electric fish type lark. You could write anything on those. Those are not evidence. And if you want to use them as evidence, that's bad.
Is that why you wrote it?
Yeah. Anyway, the claim gained traction because the data was released following a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit by the group Public Health and Medical Professionals for Transparency, which frames the release as a leak or a dump of hidden secrets, adding to the conspiratorial narrative. But unfortunately, it was just, again, a complete misrepresentation of the facts. So, but what about the 1976 swine flu vaccination? This is true. It was halted, but this was due to a reported increase in cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a rare neurological condition that causes temporary or permanent paralysis. While the 40 deaths figure is sometimes cited in retrospect, the timeline of the suspension was actually as follows. So, by mid-December 1976, federal health officials identified a statistically significant increase in Guillain-Barré syndrome among those vaccinated. The risk was estimated at approximately 1 additional case of GBS per 100,000 vaccinations. So on December of the same year, the program was suspended to investigate this link, especially as the predicted swine flu pandemic had failed to materialize. Earlier in the program, extensive media coverage of several deaths, notably 3 elderly people in Pittsburgh who died of heart attacks shortly after the vaccination, caused localized panics. However, investigations at the time concluded these deaths were not related to the vaccine. Ultimately, over 500 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome were reported following the 43 to 45 million vaccinations given, with approximately 25 to 30 deaths subsequently linked to Guillain-Barré, which is horrible. It's very sad, but again, that's been slightly misrepresented. Now, the exact mechanism remains somewhat unknown. There's a thing that scientists think might have caused it called molecular mimicry. And apparently, basically, this is where the immune system mistakenly starts to attack the body's own nerves whilst responding to vaccine components. But it's important to note that since 1976, seasonal flu vaccines have shown no link or far, far smaller than the 1976. Roughly, additionally, 1 case of Guillain-Barré syndrome per over 1 million doses. So there's always somebody that's going to be unlucky and catch a horrible side effect, but weighed up against the greater good. You know, people are allergic to all sorts. People are allergic to peanuts. People are allergic to penicillin, aspirin, stuff like that. Like, it's, these things happen. But importantly, he claims at this point to be a pro-vaxxer, but just not the COVID vaccine. He says that he's absolutely pro-vaccine. The only thing that he's opposed to is the COVID vaccine, despite the fact that he has had both jabs at this particular juncture. So in April 2022, Cartland decides to write to the GMC. And this is what he writes in the letter to the GMC. You asked me to provide any information that I feel is relevant for the PAG to consider. After giving it some thought, I've decided to show you the scientific reasoning behind my stance on the COVID-19 vaccines. Where possible, I've drawn on peer-reviewed papers. However, I also consider preprints, articles, and anecdotal evidence to be important tools in informing opinion. When Frances Oldham Kelsey refused to authorize thalidomide for market in the United States, she had very little data to go on, but a strong feeling that something wasn't right. Thalidomide had already been approved in 21 countries, and Kelsey found herself under considerable pressure from the manufacturers to authorize it. Despite this, she was adamant that thalidomide not be approved in the US until the manufacturers had proven that the drug was not harmful to the fetus. She also asked for clarification on the study out of the UK that documented cases of peripheral neuritis. As we now know, Frances Oldham Kelsey was vindicated when it was discovered that thalidomide crossed the placental barrier and caused several thousands of severe birth defects. Here is my reasoning on the COVID-19 vaccines. Number one, the concept behind all of the COVID-19 vaccines is that our own cells produce a fragment of the virus, the spike protein, and our immune systems produce antibodies to that fragment. Two, unfortunately, we now know that the spike protein is not benign. It causes some of the worst symptoms of COVID-19 disease. The spike protein is a toxin, and the vaccines teach our bodies how to make it. Three, all currently available COVID-19 vaccines turn our cells into spike protein factories, which flood our bodies with spike proteins in concentrations that vary from individual to individual. Okay, well, let's have a look at some of that. So, is the spike protein a toxin? Well, it's true that the spike protein is the part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that facilitates entry into cells. There is a critical difference between the wild protein and the version that is found in vaccines. It's been modified for stability. You see, the spike protein produced by the mRNA vaccines is modified. Specifically, it's something that's called a proline substitution. To lock it into a pre-fusion state, this prevents it from easily binding to and fusing with human cells in the way that the live virus does. The vaccine instructions include a transmembrane anchor. This is designed to keep the produced spike proteins attached to the surface of the cells that created them, mostly near the injection site, rather than allowing them to circulate freely as toxins in the blood. Research published in Circulation has detected tiny amounts of spike protein in the blood of some vaccinees, but these levels are significantly lower than those found during a natural COVID-19 infection and generally disappear within days. So what about this concept that, so what the actual data says is that no, it doesn't. It's a different type of the spike protein. It's not the wild type. The amount is absolutely tiny in comparison to the wild type that you would catch from getting a dose of COVID, and it's designed in such a way that it doesn't get into the bloodstream and spread. Are they spike protein factories? Like, the claim is that basically this teaches your body to continually make the disease. Well, the term factory implies an indefinite process, but in reality, mRNA is actually very fragile. mRNA is naturally unstable and is broken down by the body's enzymes or the ribonucleases, which I probably got completely correct. And this is done quite quickly. Most mRNA from the vaccine is degraded within 48 to 72 hours. And once the mRNA template is gone, the cell stops producing the spike proteins. The protein itself is then cleared by the immune system. So those particular concerns are, well, you don't need to be concerned about them. But he goes on. 4. In 2020, it was known that the virus was able to reverse transcribe into our DNA, despite claims to the contrary by Pfizer. Their vaccine, mRNA, has now been shown to enter our cell nuclei. 6 hours after vaccination, the vaccine begins to weave itself into our DNA, where it could produce toxic spike proteins indefinitely. Okay, so this is based on a study that had actually just come out when he's putting this letter together. It's a study by Alden and Al from Lund University, reverse transcription into DNA, or the Alden study, as it's sometimes called. And the claim is that the vaccine alters DNA. Now, it is important to note that the study itself and the scientific community has cited severe limitations. So the study used what are called HUH7 cells, which are derived from human liver cancer. These cells are biologically abnormal and often overexpress an enzyme called line-1, which can facilitate reverse transcription. The study took place in a plastic dish, so in vitro, using high concentrations of the vaccine. This has not been replicated in healthy human bodies in vivo. Now, the thing is, in vitro, you can do anything. In vitro, you can destroy cancer cells by pouring a shot of whiskey onto them. But that doesn't happen inside the body. That just happens because the cells are exposed to the elements, essentially, and so they don't work in the same way. So this is a thing that happens a lot of the time. In vitro studies seem to have very promising outcomes, but then they can never be replicated in vivo, which means that it just doesn't work inside the body in the same way. Now, the study showed that the DNA fragments were created in the dish, but it did not show that those fragments entered the cell nucleus or integrated into the human genome. The researchers themselves stated that their study does not prove that the vaccine changes our genetic code. So that's slightly awkward, isn't it? But that's where that particular idea came from. It came from a study that doesn't say that. Number 5, despite claims that the spike protein would be rapidly eliminated, we now know that it is produced in the body indefinitely. This means that the vaccinated are exposed to its toxic effects for a very long period of time. So the claim is that the COVID-19 vaccine spike protein is produced indefinitely and is toxic. And this is a complete misinterpretation of the scientific data. Research has evolved to show that the protein persists longer than the few days originally estimated, but it's by no means permanent. And there is no evidence it's toxic, and particularly in the concentrations produced by vaccination. The mRNA from vaccines is fragile and typically degrades within days, sometimes lasting a couple of weeks, but usually it's within days. And the instructions disappear, which means that there's no blueprint, there's no way for the body to know how to continue to produce this. So once it's gone, it won't do it. So that's a complete misrepresentation. Early estimates suggested that the protein would vanish in days, but sensitive testing has since found that it can linger for weeks, in rare cases, in even rarer cases, months. One particular study did actually find spike protein fragments in blood for up to 28 days. And another study detected fragments in roughly 50% of people tested in as much as up to 6 months after the vaccination. That's problematic, no? No. Because the vaccine-induced spike protein is immunogenic. It basically it's what it causes. It triggers an immune response. It's not toxic. That's the whole point of it, is to trigger the response that you would have to the disease without introducing the harmful aspects of the disease. It's modified to be locked in a specific shape that prevents it from effectively binding to and damaging the cells like the actual virus does. So again, that particular concern is incorrect.
Is it kind of like non-alcoholic beer?
I would, yeah, something like that. I think so. It basically,
it's so you get the taste of it, but you don't get the drunk of it. You know, like
yeah, or like a CBD spliff.
Yeah.
Or something.
Okay. Cool.
Like a bit, yeah, kind of
Yeah.
like that. Like, you know, that's dreadful that, like, in this quite serious discussion now, basically, like, go-to explanations are, it's a bit like drugs and alcohol, isn't it? But, you know, I think that speaks.
Some dare call it conspiracy.
So anyway, 6. A recent autopsy study revealed that deceased vaccinated patients had severe pathology to their vital organs caused by the vaccine. The pathologist determined that the vaccine had caused 14 out of 15 of the deaths. Families in most countries are finding it extremely difficult to convince coroners to conduct full autopsies. The net effect is to obscure evidence of a causal link between the vaccines and death, especially since most of the bodies are soon cremated. I am not alone in finding this concerning. Now, this claim is a well-known piece of misinformation that stems from a study that was self-published, that did not undergo peer review and has been roundly debunked by the medical and forensic communities. So the study in question was by, you might have heard of these people, Dr. Arne Burkhardt and Dr. Susharit Bhakdi. These were very prominent sort of COVID denialists, essentially. And here's the breakdown of why their conclusions are considered scientifically invalid. 1, they have a fundamental selection bias. This 14 out of 15 deaths figure is statistically, basically they looked at 15 deaths, right, in this study. That's not enough. It just simply isn't enough, basically. The way that the samples were chosen also means it's essentially pointless. The families who provided the bodies for these autopsies already believed that the vaccine had killed their loved ones. So this is a hand-picked group. This is not a representative sample. And you can't determine the risk of a vaccine by looking at only 15 people who died. You've got to compare this against the hundreds of millions of people who were vaccinated and didn't die. There's also a complete lack of baseline medical history. The pathologists in this study claim that finding lymphocytes, which is white blood cells in organs, like in the heart or the lungs, was proof of vaccine-induced attack. However, most of the deceased in the study were elderly. The average age was over 70, and most of the cohort of the 15 had chronic illnesses. Forensic experts have pointed out that the presence of white blood cells in organs is a common finding in autopsies of people who die from various natural causes, including heart disease and unrelated infections. Burkhardt failed to prove these cells were there because of the vaccine. Now, in forensic science, establishing a causal link requires specific evidence, like the presence of the vaccine-induced spike protein in the absence of the actual virus. So there's this thing called the lymphocytic riot that Burkhardt coined, and this is a completely unscientific term to describe the inflammation that he claims he saw. However, independent pathologists who reviewed his slides noted that the inflammation was often mild or consistent with age-related decline and not a lethal attack by the immune system as he had claimed. 7. The spike protein seriously damages the lining of our heart and blood vessels. It causes microscopic blood clots that prevent the lungs from adequately supplying oxygen to our body. In susceptible individuals, these micro blood clots clump together. They can lead to a fatal COVID-19 in all ages, as well as myocarditis, strokes, and heart attacks seen in younger people who receive the vaccine. The majority of these vaccine injuries occur within 48 hours of injection. Around 80% of vaccine deaths occur in the first 14 days after vaccination. For many, the microclotting may manifest as tiredness and lethargy as the blood loses its oxygen carrying capacity, but each booster shot increases the risk of larger clots forming. Colleagues have remarked on elevated D-dimer findings in vaccinated individuals, which support this explanation. The fact that no formal studies are being carried out to investigate this makes me concerned. So again, like, it's not how it works. The spike protein is modified to stay locked in a specific shape and then broken down into fragments. There's no evidence that the vaccine-induced spike proteins act as toxins to damage blood vessel linings. But in contrast, SARS-CoV-2, COVID, actually replicates throughout the body and is known to cause severe vascular damage and clotting. The claim of microclots often relies on D-dimer tests, which measure blood clotting activity. However, D-dimer levels can be elevated by many factors, including mild inflammation, age, obesity, and they're not proof of blood clots in asymptomatic individuals. 8. Analysis of the US VAERS database reveals that a small number of batches from each manufacturer were exceptionally toxic, leading to an extremely high number of strokes, heart attacks, severe reactions, and deaths when distributed. Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J's products all showed excessive batch-to-batch variation, with fluctuations more than 10 times greater than flu. At best, this indicates grossly negligent, non-compliant manufacturing practice. At worst, malfeasance. The problematic vaccines should have been recalled. Right, okay, we've talked about this before. Like, this is nonsense. Like, there was no evidence of toxic batches of COVID-19. This argument stems from basically like people looking for clumps of VAERS reporting. But as we've said before, anyone can submit a report to VAERS, and it doesn't mean anything. It's there. People will investigate it and see if it's a thing, but 9 times out of 10, it's just nothing. So to use that as proof it doesn't work. Plus, it's absolutely it's correlation. Like, what they're saying is they're actually trying to explain why, if the vaccine is so toxic, why isn't everyone dead from the vaccine? And it's, well, they must have had some vaccines that were really poisonous. And it's like, isn't the simpler explanation that there was a virus going around? Like, you know, hey ho. So, but some batches have more reports. So why? Well, this is to do with batch size and distribution. Early batches were often smaller and distributed to high-risk populations such as the elderly or those with terminal illnesses. Naturally, more deaths and health events occur in these groups, leading to a higher number of reports for that specific batch. Early in the pandemic, there was heightened public and medical scrutiny, leading to hypervigilance and higher frequency of reporting compared to later. So larger batches distributed to, were also distributed to younger, healthier populations. So again, it's just how statistics work. It's not an indication of anything. 9, the spike protein doesn't just embed itself in our DNA, it also soaks up the BRCA1 and 53 BP1 proteins that are essential to patch up our DNA when it gets damaged by a number of environmental factors, for example, sunlight and pollution. It is clear that this can only cause degradation of our DNA, which will inevitably lead to a number of unpleasant syndromes, including rapid aging, shortened lifespan, neurological disorders, and cancers. Okay, so this is based on another study. Like, so he's not pulling this out of his arse. He's got some studies, like, but we can now look at these studies, and with the gift of hindsight, we can see that these were not particularly good studies. This is a 2021 in vitro study by Zhang and Mej, which suggested that spike protein could enter the nucleus and inhibit DNA repair proteins. This study was retracted by the authors in May 2022. So it's been retracted at this point. The fundamental flaws were the study used an artificial 6-HIS tag attached to the spike protein, which likely caused the protein to enter the nucleus, a phenomenon that does not happen with the actual vaccine-induced spike. The experiments were conducted on isolated cells in a lab using concentrations of spike proteins far higher than anything found in any vaccinated human body. And the spike protein produced by mRNA vaccines is, as we've discussed, designed to stay locked on the surface of cells and to trigger an immune response. The mRNA vaccines never enter the cell nucleus where the DNA is stored, and unlike the virus, which replicates and produces protein for an extended period, vaccine-induced spike protein is only produced for a short time and then cleared by the immune system. There's absolutely no evidence of cancers, turbo cancers, rapid aging, shortened lifespan. In fact, the longer we go on, the longer you see that basically vaccination was a really good thing, and the majority of deaths, or the larger percentage of deaths, was in unvaccinated people. And that's just the way it is. And what are we on now? Getting up to nearly 5 years after the vaccine. Like, when is this mass dropping dead of people? It's just not happening. Millions of people have been vaccinated, billions, in fact. Monitoring systems have not detected any increase in adverse neurological, physiological, DNA damage, anything like that. Leading oncology and virology experts also say there's no actual plausible biological mechanism for any of that to happen. So it's unlikely. 10. The vaccine also forces our white blood cells, lymphocytes, to express spike proteins on their surface. This makes them look suspiciously like viruses. Since our CD8 killer T cell lymphocytes are programmed to destroy viruses, they immediately start killing themselves and each other with catastrophic consequences. Our immune system begins to die off. This is likely to result in more frequent and more serious bacterial and viral infections. Some doctors are already describing cases of vaccine-induced AIDS, in which patients have become seriously immune compromised following vaccination. As a physician, I would be more reassured instead of the plethora of fact-checking articles debunking the existence of virus-induced AIDS. Some investigational studies would be better. Until we get more data, I believe the only rational approach is to take this worrying anecdotal evidence as a safety signal. Right. I mean, the central premise that vaccines force the white blood cells to express spike proteins and then attack themselves is incorrect. The mRNA vaccines primarily target muscle cells at the injection site and antigen presenting cells like dendritic cells in the lymph nodes. They do not infect or reprogram your entire population of T or B cells to produce spike proteins. And even when a cell, like a dendritic cell, presents a piece of the spike protein on its surface, it's doing so to train the immune system not to trigger a suicidal mass death event. This is basically the fundamental way that all vaccines and also natural immunity works. If the immune system were dying off, we'd see a massive drop in white blood cell counts in billions of vaccinated people, and we just haven't seen this. So the term vaccine-acquired immunodeficiency syndrome is a social media fabrication based on some idiocy that a man called Luc Montagnier came out with, which we'll come on to in a minute. But AIDS is caused by HIV. There is no such thing as VAIDS. 11. Lymphocytes are also responsible for keeping cancers in check. Doctors worldwide are now reporting a huge rise in sudden aggressive turbo cancers in the vaccinated. Patients in remission are experiencing a resurgence of their cancers after getting vaccinated. In the absence of any official effort to investigate this phenomenon, the only rational response for any physician is to be informed by the mounting anecdotal evidence and treat it as a safety signal. It's not a thing. There's no such thing as turbo cancer. Cancer is a multi-step process that typically takes years or sometimes decades to develop. And the suggestion that a vaccine could cause sudden aggressive stage 4 cancer is just laughable. It goes against everything that is known about biological oncology, essentially. While it's true that T cells help identify and kill cancer cells, there's no evidence that the vaccines impair this function. Yeah, if the lymphocytes were being exhausted or depleted, as the claim suggests, we would see a massive increase in opportunistic infections, things like tuberculosis or like fungal infections. But again, this has simply not happened. 12. As part of the spike protein, the S1 subunit appears to have been designed to break off at a point called the PRRA, polybasic furin cleavage site. This feature makes it exceptionally good at infecting humans, which does not seem to support the gain of life of function lab origin theory. The PRRA sequence has never been seen in any naturally occurring coronavirus, but it does appear in a Moderna patent from 2016. The chance of a virus naturally mutating to match the sequence in the Moderna patent has been calculated as 3 trillion to 1. So this claim combines a genuine scientific observation, which is the presence of this furin cleavage site, with a statistical fallacy regarding a Moderna patent. So here's a breakdown of why this 3 trillion to 1 calculation is nonsense. The claim states that the PRRA, proline arginine alanine sequence has never been seen in any naturally occurring coronavirus. This is not true. Furin cleavage sites are common in many viruses, including other coronaviruses like MERS and the common cold virus, HCOV-OC43. While SARS-CoV-2 is the first sarbecovirus, a specific subgroup found within an FCS, one of those cleavage things, similar motifs have been found in its close relatives in bats. Evolution frequently borrows or develops these sites because they help a virus enter human cells more efficiently. So this claim, where does this claim come from? It hinges on something in the Moderna pattern. It's a 19 nucleotide sequence in the virus that matches a sequence found in a 2016 Moderna pattern. And if people want to look it up, it's US patent 9,587,3. A 19 nucleotide match sounds significant, but in the context of genetics, that's actually quite short. The 19 nucleotide string in question is part of a chain that contains over 30,000 nucleotide vital genomes, and is basically, that itself is part of a much larger patent document. The sequence in the virus does not actually match the patent sequence directly. It matches the reverse complement, so the mirror image of the DNA strand. But when they look for the specific nucleotide sequence in other places, they found it actually occurs in various organisms, including bacteria and birds. So the claim is made, right, that it matches in this. It doesn't. It's backwards. But it does actually match in other things that are found in nature. So the idea that it matching is strange is wrong. And the idea that it matches in the vaccine is also wrong. Now, the 3 trillion figure comes from another study that was dismissed by the scientific community for various reasons. And this is called Ambetti et al. In 2022. So this is basically something called the birthday paradox. If you look at a large enough data set, like all patents ever filed, right, versus all viral genomes, the odds of finding a short coincidental match are actually very high. It's almost certain that you'll find 2 sets of corresponding things that match. So the authors calculated the odds of that specific sequence appearing in that specific spot. And this is like shuffling a deck of cards, dealing them out, and then saying the odds of these cards being in the exact order are 1 in 8 times 10,678 times 10 to the 67th power. The event only seems impossible because you're calculating the odds after it already happened. So the sequence in the Moderna patent was actually part of the human gene related to DNA repair. And finding a human-like sequence in a virus is a common natural occurrence called horizontal gene transfer or molecular mimicry. So the long and short of it is that basically it's just wrong. Just wrong. It continues after 13. After it breaks off, the S1 subunit is capable of traveling through our spinal cord and up into our brain. We now know that the S1 subunit contains a prion domain that can cause the type of damage to the brains associated with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and dementia, mad cow disease. The prion domain in the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is not present in other coronaviruses. So the claim states that the SARS-CoV-2 has a spike protein that's got a prion domain not found in other coronaviruses. In 2020, some researchers noted that a small part of the spike protein had prion-like motifs, which are areas rich in glycine and uncharged amino acids. However, prion-like does not mean is a prion. So thousands of human proteins and many viral proteins have these motifs. They're simply structural features and do not mean that the protein can fold incorrectly and cause disease, like the proteins responsible for CJD or mad cow disease. So these prions essentially cause brain damage. Like Contrary to the claim, however, similar motives have been found in other coronaviruses, including the original SARS-CoV-1. But can the vaccine spike protein reach the brain? Like it says, it breaks off and travels through your spinal cord, like, like a lift, boom. But the brain is actually protected by a highly selected filter, while some studies in mice using massive direct injections of spike protein suggested it could cross the blood-brain barrier. This does not translate to human vaccination. There is no physiological mechanism for vaccine-induced spike proteins to travel through the spinal cord. 14. Humanized mice challenged with the spike protein developed spongiform encephalopathy, colloquially known as mad cow disease. There have been many reports of sudden onset CJD in the vaccinated. Coincidentally, there have been reports of BSE in cattle, including one case on a farm in the UK. Interestingly, the EU has just re-legalized the feeding of animal carcasses to livestock. Oddly, a disproportionate amount of media coverage has been given to this man's strange culinary habits. I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but I would not be at all be surprised to see CJD in the headlines again at some point. CJD and other prion diseases typically take years or decades to develop. The claim that people develop CJD within weeks of vaccination is biologically impossible for a prion disease. Millions of people have actually been monitored post-vaccination. According to the CDC, the Alzheimer's Association, and various other institutions that will be concerned about this, there's absolutely no evidence of any increase in CJD, dementia, or brain damage, prion diseases, anything like that. Many of these claims stem from the self-published study by the late Luc Montagnier, which was widely criticized for its lack of peer review, poor methodology, and cherry-picked cases. And this is also where the idea of vaccine-induced AIDS comes from. 15. Macaque monkeys tested with the spike protein developed Lewy bodies. Lewy body dementia is rapidly progressive, with patients typically dying 5 to 7 years after diagnosis. There are many reports of sudden onset dementia in people who have had the vaccine. Okay, so this is a study that's often cited making this argument. It was conducted by the BPRC in the Netherlands. There is a problem with suggesting that this is caused by the vaccine. This study is not about vaccines, it's about the disease itself.
Right.
Yes, exactly. So the researchers infected these macaques with live SARS-CoV-2 virus via the nose and trachea. Some of the infected monkeys showed signs of brain inflammation and the presence of alpha-synuclein, which is a protein associated with this Lewy bodies disease. The study demonstrated how a severe viral infection can cause neuroinflammation, but it didn't use vaccines, and it didn't show that the vaccine-induced spike protein has the same effect. So also basically, again, it's the same thing. It doesn't work like that. Lewy body dementia is a chronic progressive condition that takes years or decades. It just simply, there is no mechanism for it to happen. 16, he goes on. The lipid nanoparticles that envelop the vaccine mRNA are themselves toxic. A Pfizer report to the Japanese government showed that these nanoparticles rapidly accumulate in the spleen, liver, and ovaries. As one colleague recently pointed out, technology is being developed to target LNPs at specific cells in the body. Our spleen, liver, and ovaries are essentially our immune detoxification and reproductive systems. Again, I find this deeply concerning. Okay, so this is, the claim that lipid nanoparticles are toxic and accumulate in vital organs is based on a common misreading of pharmacokinetic data, which is basically about how substances move through the body. So the Pfizer Japan report. The document often cited is a biodistribution study submitted by Pfizer to the Japanese Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Agency, the PMDA. The study showed that the vast majority, over 95% of the dose, remained at the injection site, the shoulder muscle, or moved to the local lymph nodes to train the immune system. Small trace amounts were detected in the liver, spleen, and ovaries. However, detected does not mean accumulated to toxic levels. In pharmacology, it's normal for any substance injected into the body to be circulated by the blood and then filtered by the liver and spleen. To see these trace amounts in the ovaries, researchers gave rats a dose 300 to 1,000 times higher than would be safe to give to a human. Even at those extreme levels, the amount found in the ovaries was less than 0.1% of the total dose. Are LNPs toxic? Well, no, they're basically just like little tiny bubbles of fat. It's apparently similar to what's found in like egg yolks and cell membranes. And they are specifically designed to be biocompatible and are broken down by the body's natural fat metabolism. So the claim that these lipids target or damage the ovaries has been extensively researched. Like massive clinical trials in the real world involving millions of women have shown absolutely no impact on fertility. Rates of conception, successful IVF treatments, and healthy births are identical between vaccinated and unvaccinated populations. The CDC and the global health authorities have monitored hundreds of thousands of pregnancies and have found no increase in risk of miscarriage or birth defects related to either LLPs or the vaccine. And the spleen and liver are basically part of the body's natural cleaning system. So for small amounts of the vaccine to reach the spleen, that actually helps create a stronger, more lasting antibody response. The liver is the body's primary filter, and seeing trace amounts of any substance there is expected and does not indicate damage. Again, there's been no spike in liver failure, chronic liver disease, or any diseases connected to the liver that might have been caused by this potential effect. 17. Both Pfizer and Moderna reports to the EMA showed that the infertility doubled in vaccinated rats compared to the control group. Moderna noted that pregnant vaccinated female rats lost fur, suffered swollen hind legs, and had limited use of their hind legs. However, Moderna didn't consider these effects to be adverse. They also noted skeletal abnormalities in pups born to vaccinated rats. The claim that infertility doubled in vaccinated rats compared to the control groups is factually incorrect. The EMA's assessment report for Pfizer and Moderna Spikevax explicitly state that the developmental and reproductive toxicity studies showed no vaccine-related effects on female fertility, mating performance, or pregnancy indices. Any slight variations in pregnancy rates observed in these studies were within the historical control range for the specific rat strains used. And this was a study by Wister and Sprague-Dawley, meaning that they were normal biological fluctuations. The physical symptoms described, fur loss, swollen limbs, were observed but correctly classified as non-adverse. So swelling and limited movement in the hind legs are common to rats that have been injected. And basically, this is because they're injected in the hind limb muscle. These effects, along with temporary fur loss or reduced weight gain, were attributed to strong innate immune activation, the same reason humans get sore arms or fevers. And they resolved quickly without impacting the animal's general health. So why is that not considered adverse? Because regulators define adverse as something that impairs functional capacity. These were temporary reactions, and they didn't really affect the rat in any way. 18. The vaccine was designed for the original Wuhan virus. The virus has mutated many times since, and the vaccines are now more than 2 years out of date. The antibodies they produce are highly tailored to the spike protein and only produced in the blood. Natural infection produces antibodies in the mucosal membranes, where they are greatly needed. The latest UK HSA data shows that the current crop of COVID-19 vaccines offer little or no protection. As a doctor, I'm concerned at the push to boost with these out-of-date injectables, given they are adding very little benefit, yet increasing exposure to risk. So the claim that these were out of date and add very little benefit is completely contradicted by the clinical data that we have in 2025 and 2026. Whilst early vaccines were based on the original strain, the technology has evolved to match circulating variants, and they continue to provide life-saving protection. 19. Whilst researching, I discovered that several experimental coronavirus vaccines were abandoned after it was discovered that they caused antibody-dependent enhancement. The animals in the trials died. The 2020 trials did not check for ADE reactions in humans. There's evidence that we're seeing ADE within the COVID-19 vaccines. The so-called breakthrough cases being observed in the vaccinated may be a form of ADE. Now, this is telling because this is a trope from the COVID-19 denialists. All the ferrets died, all the rats died. Can you remember that? Like, and I challenged everyone that showed me that paper. Can you point out to me where in the paper it says that the animals died? And can you believe that in none of the papers presented, the animals died? The animals died afterwards because animals in experiments are killed after the experiments, but it wasn't caused by a thing. And ADE is just not. It's just not true. It's just completely made up. Yeah, like all authorized vaccines, including Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, underwent rigorous animal testing in mice, rats, and monkeys before or alongside early animal trials. There were no vaccine-related deaths in their pre-clinical studies. And a common source of confusion is that animals in vaccine research are often, sadly, euthanized at the end of the study so that scientists can examine their internal organs for signs of pathology. These were planned procedures, not deaths caused by the vaccines. But he's saying that in his research, he's found that. Well, he's not read the papers then, has he? He's just repeating stuff that he's heard on the internet. Like 20, the vaccine doesn't prevent the vaccinated from catching or spreading the virus. Instead, it appears to limit the severity of the disease by suppressing our immune response. This allows the virus to persist for an unnaturally long time, which creates the perfect environment for it to mutate and evade the vaccines. In effect, every vaccinated person becomes an individual gain-of-function laboratory, harboring and incubating the virus, potentially causing more deadly vaccine-resistant variants. Several eminent scientists, including Dr. Gert van Bosch and Nobel laureate virologist Professor Luc Montagnier, have warned that vaccinating indiscriminately in the midst of a pandemic is not a scientifically sound policy. The data out of Israel and the UK appears to be proving them correct. Narrator's voice. The data out of Israel and the UK HSC did not prove them to be correct. We've discussed this, right? Like, the primary way a virus mutates is by replicating. By reducing the overall spread and replication of viruses, vaccines actually decrease the opportunity for new variants to emerge. Major variants like alpha and beta emerged in the population before vaccines were widely available. And evolutionary biologists state that the variants are a result of prolonged infections in the general population, not a reaction to the vaccine. Gert van der Bosch and Luc Montagnier. The warnings from these individuals regarding vaccine-induced variants have been widely rejected by the global scientific community. Montagnier's claims, including the theory that vaccines cause HIV or a type of AIDS, or that all vaccinated people would die within 2 years, have been proven categorically false. The World Health Organization and other major bodies have confirmed there is no evidence supporting their theories. So the UK, HSE and Israel data, high numbers of breakthrough cases in highly vaccinated countries like the UK and Israel are a reflection of high vaccine coverage, not vaccine failures. Current 2026 data continues to show that while protection against mild infection wanes, the vaccines remain highly effective at preventing hospitalization and death, roughly 43 to 75% effective against severe outcomes, depending on the age group and the timing of the last dose. So vaccinated individuals do not act as gain-of-function laboratories. On the contrary, the vaccination provides a critical layer of defense that limits the virus's ability to replicate and mutate. The benefits of preventing severe disease, particularly with the updated 2026 formulations, continue to far outweigh the risks of natural infection. So anyway, he concludes his letter to the GMC. As you can see, I have a strong argument for my cautious stance on the COVID-19 vaccines. I'm sure that you can imagine it was quite a shock to discover that the vaccine of spike protein could cause the above side effects. I initially felt upset that I've been misled to the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. If a friend, family member, or patient expressed similar views, I would have to empathize with them. I know exactly how it feels to realize that you've been injected with an irreversible gene therapy that could potentially cause you acute and long-term adverse health problems that you would never have consented to had you been properly informed. My learning from the above experience is that I've recognized the importance of being empathetic and open-minded to what my patients tell me. having had the unnerving experience of finding that magnets stick to my injection site, despite there being no magnetic adjuvants or excipients listed on the ingredients. I have valid and pressing questions for which I have to date received no satisfactory answers. I'm not the only person seeking these out. In a 15th of March 2022 letter to a UK column journalist, the RCGP admitted that the reason the GP cannot give you long-term information on side effects or the exact ingredients of a vaccine is because that information is not available to them. Going forward, I would be following the vaccine safety and efficacy data with great interest. I would also like to participate in any studies that might shed a light on the long-term effects of the vaccines. Due diligence, albeit late, is better than none at all. The WHO state that 67% of humanity has already received at least one injection. They expect to reach 70% by midsummer and 75% by the end of 2022. If the COVID vaccines turn out to be another thalidomide, there will be no going back. I look forward to discussing these points with you. I am more than happy to look at additional safety data as it becomes available. So please send anything that you think I should take a look at. Meanwhile, I will continue and to maintain a cautious approach. Yours sincerely, Dr. David Cartland.